I just had some really incredible experiences. And so tonight what I'm going to do is share a few of those. I'm going to do a little intro into monarch ecology, a little intro into what exactly bike touring is, in case you have no idea, and then tell some stories and have time for questions. And if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat or comments, and we'll get to them at the end. So first, let me pull up my screen so I can share some photos. Photos are always helpful. So you should be seeing a monarch butterfly. This particular monarch is a male monarch, and you can tell because of those black dots on his hind wings. Those little black, or the black glands here, are scent glands that are only on the males. So this is a male monarch. This is the hero of our story. This is one of millions of monarchs that migrate every year, and this particular male is nectaring on a type of plant, and that's the other hero of the story, called milkweed. And milkweed is an incredible plant. You can see they have those beautiful clusters of flowers. They remind me of shooting stars, and there's many different species. There's about 100 species in North America. The monarchs utilize about 70 of those, but they have their favorites. And this is a swamp milkweed, which is quite common in backyard gardens and pollinator gardens. And the males and females, they will get nectar from these. But what makes the milkweed so important is that the milkweed is the only food source of the monarch caterpillar. And if you tear one of those leaves, you'll most typically see this like white latex sap. That sap is poison, and most herbivores don't want to have anything to do with it. It makes it taste bitter. It's a heart-stopping toxin. So most herbivores avoid it, but monarch caterpillars eat this milkweed, sequester the poison in their own bodies, and thus become poisonous themselves. So the bright orange of this male monarch is a warning to predators that when he was a caterpillar, he ate milkweed, became poisonous, and is now not the best meal. And wow, I just love him so much. So let me dive a little deeper and talk about the migration. This is a range map of the monarch butterfly, and if you're looking on a small screen, don't worry about the words. Really, all you need to know is that the monarchs are migratory, and at least in North America they are, and the yellow is where they spend the summer months. The green is spring, orange is fall, and then there's a few little splotches of blue. We have blue in California, where the western monarchs overwinter. We have some blue in Florida with a question mark, and if folks are interested and we have time, I can talk about the monarchs in Florida. And then the real showstopper is this blue dot in Mexico. That dot straddles two states in Mexico, the state of Mexico, and then Michoacan. And most of the monarchs, the majority of monarchs that are born between the Rocky Mountains and the Atlantic Ocean fly to this one spot. And you can see their summer, spring, fall range is quite enormous, and then their winter range is very, very small, which means that's why they form those concentrated clusters. And I could go on and on and on about how incredible the ecology of monarchs are in Mexico. And I have a few pictures, and if folks have questions about anything specific to monarchs in Mexico, I'm happy to try and answer those. But for now, let's put their range map to my route. And that red line is the route of my bicycle tour. And that red line's, I shouldn't say approximately, because it's 10,201 miles. And it took me about 9 months. And I started in Michoacan, where the monarchs overwinter, in mid-March. So we're coming up on my departure date. And I went north through Texas, into Kansas City. That's where I grew up, and that's actually where I am right now. Over through the Midwest, or over through the upper Midwest, excuse me, to the East Coast, and then did a loop back. And you can see that there's lots of zigs and zags in this, and every zig and zag is basically proof of some invitation. So when I left Michoacan, I had a general sense of where I wanted to go. I knew I wanted to go north. I knew I wanted to go clockwise, but like the specifics were not known to me. But what would happen is as I was biking, people would hear about my trip, and maybe they'd send me an email or message me on social media and say, hey, I heard about your trip. I live in the Twin Cities and I have a garden and I'd love for you to come and talk to my nature preserve or whatever the case was. And I really did try as much as possible to say yes. I tried to go where the energy was. And that was for two reasons. One, I was trying to give lots of presentations. I spoke to about 9,000 people on my tour. And the point being, the more people that know about the monarchs, the more people there will be to help protect them. And then I also was trying to get into, for the same reason, trying to do lots of interviews with media, newspapers, TV, radio, you name it. And so if someone was really, really excited about my trip and they were like, hey, I'll organize a presentation and I'll do this and I'll do that, then they would really help me make my voice louder. So that's for all the zigzags. And then as far as what bike touring even is, here's a photo of me. I think I'm in Vermont at this point, and there's a bunch of common milkweed behind me. Common milkweed is it's like my best friend at this point. I'm always so excited when I see common milkweed. But this is my bike, and you can see my bike is nothing special. It's a beater bike. Cost about $300 to put together about over a decade ago. So you don't need to have the fanciest gear to do a trip. You just need a comfortable bike that is sturdy. And in fact, the kind of the garage sale look, the garbage look, if you will, was actually an asset because I could lean this puppy up against a grocery store pretty much anywhere, and I could go in and I could get groceries for the day and not really have to worry about someone seeing my bike and thinking, ooh, that's some fancy racing bike I'm going to steal. And on my bike, you'll see I've got these bags. They're called panniers. The front ones are store-bought. And in the front ones, I had my sleeping bag, sleeping pad, my laptop, camera, journal, book, light, those sort of things. And then in the back here, I had everything for cooking. So I had a small little stove and a cook pot. I'd try and buy about a day's worth of food at a time. That would vary. So there were times in Mexico where I maybe have 3 or 4 or 5 days of food. But I tried to just do about once a day shopping. If you start shopping more than that, you start buying lots of weird stuff that you don't need. So I tried to keep it to once a day. And then I also have my tools on the outside there. That blue thing behind my seat is a little folding chair. And when I'd give presentations, one of my favorite gags was asking kids if they thought I had a sofa on the trip, and no one thinks you have a sofa on a bike tour. And then I'd pull out my camp chair and every kid would roll their eyes and be like, oh, who is this lady? But then the other thing on the back there is my tent. And what I love about this setup is you're self-contained and you really have this immense amount of freedom because it doesn't matter where you end up at that night. You have everything you need. So you don't have to have a map and have every single day planned out. And in fact, I preferred not to. So I might know in a week I was going to stay at this one person's house or this other person's house, and I knew I had to go in this general direction. But in the days in between, I just rode until I was tired, and then I would do my thing. So, So bike touring in this way, there's lots of different ways to bike tour, but this self-sufficient way is just I just really, really love it, and I find it the best way to travel for me. So like I was saying, totally free. I would just stop and cook when I was hungry and camp when I was tired. I was on the road for about 9 months and I never once paid to camp. It's called stealth camping often. So here's a great perfect example. There's my tent, and then there's a car. This is on a highway in Texas, and there are fences for every single mile of Texas. So I was just always just camping in these kind of like right-of-ways, highway easements, and trying to be hidden in plain sight. And well, first of all, people are always like, oh my gosh, that's so terrifying. I've always felt really safe. I mean, for one part, there's not a lot of randos walking on the highway in the middle of the night this far from anywhere. I feel much safer here than I would in a public campground where, you know, cars are going in and out, and lots of people around. And then the other thing was like, I would go to bed when it was dark, so no one would even be able to look for me. Like, there's just miles and miles of highway to search for me. So I felt really, really safe. And I also love this because it bonded me to the experience of the monarch, right? So there's this small little insect that's able to travel from Mexico north into Canada, or not, they don't, I haven't mentioned yet, but it's not one generation that does the entire loop. Excuse me. So the monarchs I started with weren't the monarchs I finished with. I started with the overwintering generation, and by the end, I was traveling with the 3rd to 5th generation. It depended. There was probably both in there. But these migrants, these monarchs, we can't just protect their habitat in Mexico and their habitat in the northern part of their range and their summer range. We have to protect a swath of land in between. And as a cyclist, I understood this, right? You can't just offer a cyclist everything they need on the first day and the last day. If it's not safe, if it's not enjoyable in between, then no one's going to do it, or no one can do it. So by camping like this, I could experience that pure joy of finding the perfect spot, which I'm sure monarchs enjoyed too from time to time. And I could also feel that desperation of biking for an extra couple hours because there's nowhere for me to go. And so I encourage folks, the next time you're on a highway, think about where would you go if you were a cyclist, or if you were a butterfly, and think, it all used to be habitat for them. It was from point A to point B, the entire route was their home. And we have cut it up, and we have paved it over, and we have replaced it with grass in many cases, and corn and cows. And so they don't have places to go. And this is really the heart of my story. I was able to add a human perspective to the threats facing the monarchs, because in the end, we're all kind of facing the same issues. So on a lighter note, camping's also really easy, or really great, because it's easy to clean your room. My room is only clean when I'm camping. And this picture is also interesting because you'll see there's not a cloud in the sky, and I'm in all my rain gear. This was on somewhere in Canada, and the no-see-ums were terrible. The little biting bugs, they were really, really hungry. And so the rain gear comes in handy for everything. When you're on a bike tour, you can't carry a different outfit for different occasions. You really need a one-stop shop. So my rain gear was my rain gear, my wind gear, my cold weather gear, my bug gear. It was a little bit of everything. And another great thing about bike touring is all these unexpected encounters. So when I left on my trip, I did not know what I was going to see or who I was going to meet, but I knew these moments would happen. And this is a perfect little example. I'm biking, I think this is in Minnesota, and I'm just like doing my thing, probably a little bored or something, and then I spot this little guy hopping across the road. And if I was in a car, by the time, well, one, I probably wouldn't have noticed, and two, by the time I've registered the creature and then found a safe place to pull over and then stopped, the moment is gone. You just keep going. But on the bike, you're like, oh great, I want to stop, my legs hurt. So often, I don't know, 20, 30 times a day, I'd pull over, throw my bike on the ground, and then go off to explore whatever I found. And these are the moments that are so exciting. And I wish that people could, in their cars, slow down enough to notice all these incredible creatures that are in their own yards, that are on their commutes, that they're passing by. And if you really stop and look, I think the world becomes more amazing. And that little toad, that's about the cutest thing in the world. Seriously. I should mention here that I love frogs. I study frogs most summers, and they are my truly favorite animal. Another great thing about bike touring is not just the more than human animals, but the people that you meet too. And this was in Mexico, and I was just again biking down a road. At this point, it was so hot, and this was like a really boring stretch of just this kind of mega highway, like, you know, just a big highway. And I was like daydreaming about this turn I was going to get to make in like 15 miles. And then I hear this motorcycle and I see him and I notice he's slowing down. And my first thought is like, oh boy, what does this dude want? And then he stops. And so I stop and I'm like, here we go. And he's like, hey, do you want some ice cream? And I'm like, oh yeah, I do. And if you read my book, you'll learn quickly that ice cream is another character in the story. I sometimes think I bike to her solely so I can eat more ice cream. And again, it was as long as I felt safe, try and say yes, because this is where the moments are. I honestly cannot remember really a moment, anything that happened between this moment and that 20 mile or that 15 mile later turn, other than that was hot and I had a headwind. But I remember this very, very vividly. And this would not have happened if I had been in a car or in a plane or in a bus. I think the vulnerability of being a cyclist yes, it makes you vulnerable, but it also opens up the possibilities of these encounters, because it's also vulnerable for him to stop and talk to me. So I'm really grateful for bike touring for that. But since I'm on the subject of ice cream, I should say it wasn't just like random roadside encounters where I got ice cream. Well, this is Margaret's house in Canada, and she was like a friend of a friend, maybe of a friend. I can't remember. A lot of times these connections were made, and then you like stop and you're like, wait, how did I end up at her house? But I did. I remember she sent me an email, and I tried to make it there one day, but I got a really late start because I was super lazy and it was very rainy. So I missed. I was gonna just pass her house by because the timing didn't work, and I was like, no, I gotta go to Margaret's house. And I'm so glad I did, because she had a dairy farm, and that she offered me ice cream from her dairy cows. And of all, I mean, I stayed with like 68 people on my tour, and I have a lot of ice cream stories, but I chose this one because I think it's another great example of how I'm bonded to the experience of the monarch. Because in the foreground, Margaret is feeding me, and in the background, she's feeding pollinators with her garden. So her house is just out of the frame. That's her backyard. And I love that there's like probably these nights where I'm like full and warm and clean for the first time in a while, and I'm just like so happy. And then I bet there's like a monarch outside that's like happy and full and feeling safe too in the garden. So the same people that were helping me were helping the monarchs, and I really love that. Now, the other great thing about biking is, I've kind of already said this, but biking with butterflies especially is you get to see all the butterflies that are in your yard. And I think we just so often forget to look and forget to notice the creatures that we're living with. And wow, what a shame. So I got really, really good at spotting monarchs while I was biking. So I bike about 10 miles an hour. And what I would do is I'd catch a glimpse of milkweed in this frame here. There's some milkweed, but I wasn't usually looking for caterpillars. They're harder to spot. I was looking for sign of caterpillars, and I'll actually zoom in. The caterpillars right here, if you haven't seen them yet. But I'll zoom in, and what I noticed with this caterpillar wasn't him, but was this green stuff here, and that's his poo. And scientists, of course, have named insect poo frass. So I noticed the frass on the leaves, and I was like, oh. So I cued in and found this guy. And this is a terrible picture to demonstrate this, but if you squint in the background, you might see here a little circle, and there's some like white edging. The other calling card of the monarch, caterpillar at least, is you'll see on milkweed, you'll see like either a little circle or horseshoe often shape. And then there's the milky latex sap dripping out. And that is like, if you see that, you need to stop and look for a caterpillar. And so while I was doing this, and like in this case, I'll go back to that one picture. I saw this caterpillar. I'm like, in this picture, I'm like legit getting ready to jump off the bike. And another great thing about having a beat up bike is you can throw it on the ground and not feel too bad. It was steel. It was a few scratches are okay. So I'd throw my bike on the ground and then I'd go exploring. Twice the cops showed up because people thought I had crashed. But I spent probably an hour in this little, or at least half an hour in this little garden, roadside garden, taking pictures and exploring. And then what I noticed on this caterpillar, I noticed this really interesting behavior I hadn't seen before, where they'd grab the frass in their mandibles and then they'd swing it around like a crane and then throw the frass over the leaf. And I keep telling the story, and then every time I'm like, I need to confirm why they do this. But I speculate that it's either one, to keep things clean, or two, my better guess is that just like I was noticing caterpillars based on their frass, that other predators would too. So it might just be a way to kind of minimize the possibility of a predator finding them. But this is just on the side of a road, right? Like we so often think about these wild moments as like Nat Geo or these documentaries or going to these wild places or national parks. And I'm like literally talking about a foot of quote weeds next to some pavement. And so I do again just think we really need to start noticing these things. And the problem though, at least for me, is I got really good at spotting caterpillars and spotting butterflies and really good at noticing. I mean, I describe it as I was just training myself to see the world through the eyes of a monarch. But then what would happen is I'd see this. And it got really depressing. So I was by myself for 10 months. And a lot of the time I was biking along roadsides that were mowed. And there were roadsides that I knew were full of caterpillars and full of monarchs. And it would be the roadside was often the last remaining habitat, and everywhere else I was looking was non-native grass and was pesticide, GMO corn, and I got really mad, right? Because at this point, like the monarchs and I, we're like traveling friends, and we're like in it together. And then I'm seeing like what they're up against, and I'm seeing, man, in so many places they stand no chance. There's no place for them to go at all. And my book and my trip was about finding a place where I could sit with my anger but also have hope, because if I had no hope I would have given up, because man, I was angry a lot. And I'll speak to that hope in a moment. But before I move on, I'm sure everyone that's listening has a green grass yard. Well, maybe not everyone. And I guess what I want to say is we have these yards because we think that's what we're supposed to do, and we think that's what it means to be a good neighbor. And I guess what I'm asking folks is, well, why are we only good neighbors to humans? And we need to rethink what our yards are. We need to think about, what does it mean to be a good neighbor to a monarch, and a good neighbor to a hummingbird, and a good neighbor to a migrating sandhill crane. Like we need to be neighbors to everyone and not just to humans, because this system won't work. Right now we are taking all the land and we are sharing barely any of it. And the way that we can change this, the way we can do this, is to start sharing our homes with nature, which is just really wonderful. It's wonderful to think that where you live could be a sanctuary for so many animals. So I really encourage folks to when they're out driving next time, or biking or walking, look at all the places that used to be monarch habitat and think, where those monarchs go? And the answer is they've disappeared. So this is a graph of the monarch population, and there's a lot of numbers. Again, probably can't read them on whatever small screen you're looking at. But the important part is, if you squint, you'll see this downward trend. So yes, it goes up and down. All natural populations in the wild fluctuate year to year. That's totally natural. But between all the fluctuations over time, it should remain stable. This population is not stable. This population is declining. And that decline could easily drop to zero. And that would be a real loss to all of North America. And I put this graph up particularly because what I really like is there's this green dotted line on here. And that green dotted line is where scientists have said this is a sustainable population. And if you look, we haven't gotten to a sustainable level hardly at all in the last 2 decades. And the reason for this is because the monarchs have less places to go. They have less places to lay their eggs. If you imagine on a moderate year that there's, I'm making up this number right now, forgive me, but 40 million monarchs. I totally made that up. I should have just said tens of millions of monarchs. And half of them are females. Those females, those tens of millions of females are all going to lay about 500 eggs. And they don't lay 500 eggs on one milkweed for obvious reasons. If there were 500 young caterpillars eating this milkweed, it would be gone in a second. Their caterpillars are eating machines. So instead what she does is she searches out one milkweed per egg. And so she'll look for that milkweed. She'll do this thing called drumming, where she has like these little, almost like claws on her feet that cut the milkweed and release the chemicals from the milkweed, so she can smell it basically to say, oh yeah, this is a good milkweed. And then she'll lay one egg and then she'll go to the next one. So that means we need tens of millions of milkweed, we need 500 milkweeds for tens of millions of monarch females. That's a lot of milkweed. I mean, I think there was a campaign to plant like 1.3 billion stems of milkweed. Whatever the exact number is, if we don't have milkweed, we don't have monarchs. And if you look around on your next commute, look at all the places that used to be milkweed, that used to be prairie with milkweed and aren't. So this is a direct result of habitat loss. And there's other things like climate change that go in there, but really habitat loss is the main driver. So it can get depressing, right? And again, I've said this already a couple times, like I was angry on my trip. Like, I think I was more angry than people would expect, because you're doing, you're biking with butterflies, but I was angry because I see these numbers, and every day people would say to me, older folks would say, when I was a kid, we used to see lots of monarchs. And it's like, yeah, and the next generation might not see monarchs. And what are we doing about it? Every person that owns land has an obligation to the next generation to share so that they also can see monarchs. And I really think that if I had no hope, I would have had to give up. And if I wasn't doing anything to help, I probably would have been even more sad and had to give up as well. So this would be where I pivot. Don't worry, people are like, dang, this lady's intense. But to talk about solutions. And for me, that was to be the monarch's voice. So like I said, I gave presentations to about 9,000 people on my tour, mostly kids, and just talking about how exciting science is and how incredible monarchs are, and offering folks other ideas, right? Like most people think, oh, you can't bike with the monarchs. And then here I am, just this normal lady that shows up in your classroom with this kind of ugly bike. It's like, oh man, if she can do that, then I can do this other thing. So that was really fun and inspiring for me to see kids get excited about nature. And doing something really helped kind of calm my anger, because if you're doing something, if you're part of a solution, no matter how small it is, it feels less overwhelming. And then on top of that, I was meeting just incredible people that were part of the solution. So these are some kids in Omaha, and their teacher fought for this garden. And it was like this really sloping part of the parking lot that was hard to mow and no one ever thought about. And she was able to get some milkweeds growing in this garden. And we went out with the third graders there, and we were like running between the plants, like yelling about finding milkweeds, yelling because we just touched poison. And then a male monarch flew over our heads, and like one kid spotted them and started, cheering, and then all of us were cheering. And it was such a beautiful moment. And that would not have happened if that garden hadn't been there. So I think school gardens are one of the most important things we can do to give all kids the opportunity to interact with nature and to be part of the solution. kids every day are hearing about how scary the world is and about climate change and all these things that are overwhelming. But if you can give them this one small little task and say, if you do this, you're helping. Wow, that is so empowering and so important. Because if you don't think you can make a difference, then you're gonna curl up into a ball because it's so overwhelming. So if you live near a school, or if a family member, a friend is in a school, these gardens are insanely hard to take care of and to maintain and get started. But if you can put in that energy, it would make all the difference in the world. Another really inspiring stop was at Bill's farm. He owns Native American seed in Junction, Texas, and his daughter actually invited me to their farm, and I said yes. It added a few miles, but not enough to say no. And I'm so glad I stayed with them. I'll never forget going down the driveway and looking over and being like, is that milkweed? And it was literally like, I'm going to put rows in quotes because it was pretty wild, but rows of milkweed being grown. And Bill started out in landscaping, planting grass. And in the 80s, he was like, wait, what am I doing? Like, God, I live in Texas. Why are we planting something that needs water and fertilizer and then mowing? And why? So he switched to planting natives, and now his family runs this really incredible operation where they grow natives, harvest the seeds, they go collect seeds from landowners in the area, and then they sell their seeds so that other people can replant Texas. And it was so awesome. I went there twice. I went there on the northbound route and the southbound route. This is another little inspiring stop, and I honestly could not tell you where it was. It's not even, I don't even think it's really native grass anymore, or I don't know what these plants are. It looks like some willows, but it says native prairie, no mowing or spraying. And I don't know much about this spot, but I remember seeing the sign and just being like, this like sense of relief. And it doesn't have to be a national park to be important land. It can be between a paved road and railroad tracks, and then in the middle of a farm. Like, these little pockets of land where we can share are so valuable to that migrant that's biking, that's going through, or the cyclist that's, trained their brain to always be looking for wild lands. And then another little moment. This is on a hilltop prairie in Sioux City, and this woman actually helped protect this land. And I knocked on older people for telling me over and over again that there used to be lots of monarchs. So anytime I met an older person that was part of the solution, it was like medicine to my soul. And every little plot of land that hasn't been turned into something else usually has a history of someone standing up for it. So pick your little plot, pick your spot, and then rally, because the next generation will be grateful. And then there's the gardens. So this is Amy's garden in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I showed up and she's like, oh, let me show you my garden. And I was like, okay, that's something. It's a little smaller than I was expecting, like me, I'm like a little like, ah. But then she's like, no, there's already been 40 monarchs on these milkweeds. And so what I love about this is, first of all, it's a great example of sharing, right? She still has some grass, she still has a little patio, she has some ornamentals, but she also has milkweed. And in doing so, she's given 40 eggs the opportunity to become adults. And most of those won't survive. That's okay. They'll become bird food or frog food or spider food, whatever it is. They're become part of the food chain, which is very, very important. But if even just a few of those survive, that's 500 eggs in the next generation. And this is in Oklahoma, so this is the start of the migration. If just those 500 eggs, if only a few of those survive, well, there's still more generations to come. So that could literally be thousands of more generations, or thousands more eggs by the end of the summer. So this is such a good example of how our efforts, even the little tiny effort, adds up to something that's really valuable. And then it doesn't have to just be a little backyard garden where you're sharing. It can be your whole yard. And this is Nadia's garden in Columbia, Missouri. And again, the picture actually only shows a little bit of her yard, but that's the point. Because, well, first of all, one of the points is don't be like embarrassed by your natives, bring them in the front yard. And this is important for two reasons. One is it starts conversations with your neighbors. And I'll direct you to over by the fire hydrant here is some common milkweed. And I asked Nadia about it. And she said, well, before her neighbors didn't know and they mowed everything. And then they found out that without milkweed, there's no monarchs. So they started mowing around that milkweed. And so, wow, look, not only did Nadia's milkweed get a chance to spread, but her ideas did too. And we need someone like Nadia on every street, being that example, giving their neighbors the opportunity to be part of the solution as well. Like, wow, I'm just so grateful for her and for everyone that's like, you know, going up against cultural norms, because it's scary to get that, you know, that look. Like I'm at my parents' house right now and I go on walks and it's just everyone's out raking and I'm like, no, those leaves, they have insects in them. But then I pass the one house that has like a sign that says leave the leaves, and I'm like, and I always purposely walk by their house because it makes me happy. But there's people doing this, and if enough people do it, that will be the norm. But we need people that believe in the monarchs to start it. Now, I guess I'll kind of end this and jump into questions. But first, what I want to do is just offer kind of a few lessons that I've learned from the monarchs. And I think the most valuable one comes from a story I have in Mexico. And this is what the monarchs look like when they're in Mexico. All these clumps are actually thousands of monarchs. So they're on the trunks, they're on these leaves, on the oyamel fir branches. And it takes about 10 monarchs equal the weight of a dime. So imagine how many dimes you'd have to stack up to be heavy enough to like literally bend this tree. It's a lot. It's thousands. And this is hopefully folks can kind of squint and see this tree bending. But I've seen, and there's been accounts of pretty big branches breaking under the weight of monarchs. And so I go here and I look at these monarchs and I think, wow, like if there's just one monarch in the forest, maybe a needle will move, but that's about it. But when you get thousands of monarchs together, like you can literally, enough monarchs can break trees. Like, wow. So just one garden, that's not going to do anything. But when you get your garden and Nadia's garden and Amy's garden and Bill's garden and Margaret's garden, when you get all these gardens together, it adds up to something big that could metaphorically break branches. And if you allow me to extend that metaphor one step further, this is the most beautiful sight. This is when the monarchs fly in Mexico. And on warm days, the monarchs will take to the sky and there'll be thousands in the air. And you can go there and you can close your eyes and you can hear the sound of their wings beating. And it's just this beautiful, it's like a beautiful humming song. And again, I think, wow, if there's just one monarch in the sky, I will never hear that. But when there's thousands and thousands flying, that adds up. So me talking, that's not enough, right? That's just some lady that people can ignore. But if we all tell the story of the monarch, and we all tell our neighbors and our families and the person that's like, oh, why is your garden like that? If we tell enough people and then they tell enough people, then our voice becomes unstoppable and unignorable. Another lesson from the monarchs is it doesn't matter where you live. This is a monarch I found. This is in Manhattan. And on my way to Manhattan, I found eggs in Queens and Brooklyn on some little milkweeds and some city parks. So if monarchs can find refuge in New York City, then they can find refuge in your yard. I guarantee it. And the last lesson I think the monarchs offer us is the lesson in slowing down and noticing. And I think they do this so well because it's so easy to stop when you see a monarch and notice their beauty. Again, this is another male nectarine on a milkweed that's commonly called butterfly weed. And I should say that monarchs don't just nectar on milkweed. They'll drink nectar from a wide variety of plants. And in fact, during the fall migration, it's so important that monarchs have lots and lots of flowers to choose from, because what they're doing in the fall migration is they are stocking up on all the energy reserves they need, not only to survive for 5 months in Mexico, but also to make the remigration flight back to Texas. So if they arrive too skinny, they will not survive. So it's so important that in the fall migration, we have lots and lots of flowers. But I digress. Back the lesson of monarchs kind of being our guides and reminding us to slow down. And this has happened time and time again, and it happened to me. First, I noticed how beautiful the monarch was, and then I slowed down to find the caterpillars. This is a small instar, and you can see there's the calling card. The plant has this milky white sap that is going to deter most herbivores. So look for that sap when you're looking for caterpillars, but you really have to slow down and notice. And then as you're looking for caterpillars, you're going to notice all the other animals that live on milkweed. So these are tussock moths. They have a really incredible story that if we run out of questions, I can talk more about tussock moths. At least milkweed tussock moths depend on milkweed as well. And then you'll start noticing the little predators. You know, I already mentioned that a female will lay 500 eggs, and some people's gut reaction is, wow, if only a few survive. What we need to do is we need to bring them in, put them in cages and protect them. And I disagree with this. I'm of the mind that we want to keep as many as possible in nature, and that those 497 eggs that don't become milkweed or don't become monarch, excuse me, they become food. And that's as important as an egg becoming a monarch. So I encourage people, instead of thinking that they're saving monarchs by rearing them, to think that they're saving monarchs by planting milkweed, because that's the real solution. And then you'll start to notice the other pollinators. This little hummingbird moth, so amazing. That's a moth. And then you'll of course notice that everything is connected. So in this common milkweed was this tiny little froglet, just metamorphosed from a tadpole. Still kind of has a little tadpole face and a little tail, seeking refuge in this milkweed. And so it doesn't matter if you love frogs or if you love milkweed or if you love monarchs or birds. I just encourage you to find that creature that speaks to you, that motivates you to rally on their behalf, and then go protect them. And in doing so, you're going to be protecting monarchs and frogs and humans as well. So the monarchs help us see that and help us know. So you don't have to ditch your job and bike across Mexico, or brave New York City, or brave the wild beans of Canada. That skunk and I, we're fine, both of us, but it was a funny moment. All you have to do is plant milkweed. And if you plant milkweed, the true adventurers on my or of the trip, of the migration, the monarchs, they will come to you. And so with that, I think I've got time. I'm going to pull a copy of my book off the shelf. I haven't done this in a while. I'm going to read one paragraph, and it's my favorite paragraph, and it's actually in the acknowledgement section. The first draft of my acknowledgement section was like 17 pages long, and my publisher was like, no, you can't do that. But I have a lot of people to thank for this. You know, it's a solo trip, but it was only thanks to hundreds and hundreds of people that I had places to stay, and I had ways to get my voice heard, and to do interviews, and to have ice cream. So I had a lot to say, but the last little bit I want to share with you all tonight. Thanks to everyone fighting in endlessly big and small ways on behalf of the monarchs and their neighbors. Our paths may not have crossed, but your efforts are seen, felt, and appreciated. Biking past an unmowed ditch or a lawn devoted to natives will always make me hoot with joy. And finally, with all my heart and soul, thanks to the monarchs, you amaze me. You have become my teachers, encouraging an adventure, teaching me Spanish, watercolor, web design, video editing, photography, networking, public speaking, gardening, stewardship, science, and love. You helped me write this book, and every word of it is for you. So that's from my book, Bicycling with Butterflies. If you're curious to see more photos, my website's beyondabook.org. I guess maybe you guys are auctioning off a book. That's really awesome. If the library has one, you can rent it from the library. But yeah, I'll close the screen, and then if folks have questions, I'm happy to chat. I see right now, right in the chat, my first impression, the first thing that caught my eye was who took the photo of you on the bike. I carried a tripod and spent way too many hours trying to take pictures of me. I remember this one moment in Canada where there were so many monarchs on these nectarine on these common milkweeds. And I spent so long. I wanted so desperately to get a monarch flying in my bike. And there was even a caterpillar. It did not happen, but I spent a couple hours doing that and had a lot of fun. I think the battery died in the end, but I also should say it wasn't, I also had a little remote, so it wasn't that as hard as I'm making it sound to get a picture. I could activate my camera remotely. So in a lot of my photos, you'll see me holding a little remote. Then if I keep going, I see, did you ever get injured? How did you handle mechanical issues? I luckily didn't get hurt on my trip. I had a cold for a few days actually on the southbound trip when I stayed with Bill at the Native American seed farm. I arrived just kind of feeling bad, and they actually had like a little guest house, and I just was like, I'm feeling bad, and so I just spent like 2 days resting. And I'm really grateful that was the worst of it. I had a few mechanical issues. One of the great things about having an old beat up bike is it's pretty easy to find what you need on the road. And I carried tools for small issues. I did have one big issue that required me buying a new rear wheel, but I got really lucky that it happened about 6 miles from a bike store. So I was able to just coast into the bike store. So I'm pretty lucky on that front. When I see someone asked how many flat tires did you have, I think I only had 2. And what happens is I buy pretty good tires at the start, and they're a little more expensive, but they last forever. And not forever. They last about 12,000 miles usually, maybe 15. And when you start getting a flat maybe once a month, and as they wear out, then you start getting a flat about once a week, and then you're like, okay, time is money. So you splurge on new tires. I skipped some questions, but let's see here. What's the lifespan of an adult monarch? Well, it's pretty interesting. Monarchs that are born in the spring and summer, they eclose from their chrysalis. They become reproductive about 3 days later, and then they live between 2 and 6 weeks longer. And during that whole time, they're mating and laying eggs. In some cases, they're still continuing the migration. In some cases, they're just staying resident. But then in the fall, the monarchs emerge, and they go through what's called sexual diapause. So it's basically a pause on reproduction. So rather than beginning to mate in 3 days, they kind of stay suspended in that juvenile state. And those are the monarchs that eclose, usually a little bit bigger, and they will fly nectarine the whole way, getting fat on roadside plants, and then they'll live off that fat all winter. And then they'll fly back to Texas in the spring, and you always can tell a remigrant because their wings are tattered and their colors are really faded. And I mean, you look at it and you're like, how did you do that? And then you'll see a just eclosed first generation monarch that's bright and perfect, and you're like, it's just like, ah. But yeah, so those monarchs, those fall migrants, will live for September, October, November, December, January, February, March. So quite a bit longer, 6 to 8 months. Let's see if anyone wants to jump. Ryan, if you want to jump in, if I'm missing any questions, or I can just keep going down the line. Did you see any monarchs that had been tagged? We hosted staffing event at our library last summer. Oh, that's cool. I was lucky enough to tag one monarch in, it might have been Indiana. I'm gonna say that right now. And then the other monarchs I saw, I didn't catch to see if they had a tag or notice. And I've seen a few tags in Mexico, but I never have been the one to spot them, which that would be really fun. But for folks that don't know, the tag is like a little sticker that's basically like a license plate. It has a digit, or it depends on the year, but a 6 or so digit code. And so people can tag these monarchs and then record, oh, I tagged monarch blah 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 on this day at this spot. And they only tag fall migrants. But then if those tags are recovered along the way, then all of a sudden oh, okay, that monarch has traveled this distance. And sometimes it's really incredible. It's like, wow, those monarchs have traveled hundreds of miles in a few days. So a lot of information has come from tagging. So that's a fun thing to do, a fun way to get involved. And you can go to Monarch Watch, monarchwatch.org. Is a really incredible nonprofit that does monarch way stations, which is where you can register your garden. There has to be you have to meet a specific set of specs, but you can register your pollinator garden with them, and you can also get tags. What is it about milkweed that makes it so attractive to monarchs? Well, so for the females, as far as I understand, they're using their eyes in order to kind of find patches of milkweed, and then they're using clues to basically smell the milkweed, and they actually can smell through their feet. So when they land on them, they're actually testing the milkweed, and they're only looking for milkweed because it's the only food source of the caterpillar. So if a monarch lays their egg on the wrong plant, the caterpillar will not survive. So the females need that, and that evolution has co-evolved, because by laying their eggs on milkweed, by the caterpillars evolving to eat milkweed, they're getting that poisonous protection. And then as far as being attracted as an adult, like I said, monarchs are generalists. They'll nectar on any plant, but those bright colors just draw them in. And milkweed are good nectaring plants, not just for milkweed, or not just for monarchs, but you'll see lots of bees and other pollinators around the milkweed. Oh, and then that on the same note, I see a question about the fall migration plants. It depends a little, and if someone has a good place to get local native plants, feel free to share that. I recommend people finding a local nursery and buying several different species of plants, because every yard is a little different, and the sun is different, and the soil and the water, everything's different. So if you plant some of the natives, they will tell you which one's the best. I will never ever stop recommending goldenrod. It's probably my favorite plant. They're a fall bloomer. People often think that they're like knapweed. They get them confused, and then they start cutting them down. It's like, no, it's not that. They're just this really beautiful yellow blooming plant. They look like waves of flowers. And actually, when I sent my book to the copy editor for a round of edits, when we were first getting to know each other, I said, there's only one line that I'm committed, it has to make it in the book. It's my favorite line. And it was, I've never met a lonely goldenrod. So goldenrod's the best. Ryan, have I missed any questions?
I just got a few from Facebook. I'm sorry, YouTube. I apologize. I was having some technical issues on my end. But when you started this journey, did you know that you were gonna end up writing a book, or did it were you just keeping like a travelogue and then it turned into a book?
Yeah, I maintained a blog for all my other trips, and wrote in a journal every night on all my other trips. And people would always ask on my other trips, when are you writing a book? And or are you writing a book? And my answer is always, are you going to buy my book? And on this trip with the butterflies, about halfway through, I knew that what I was saying was important, and I knew that people wanted to hear more, and that people were interested, and that I could make my voice louder by writing. So when I finished my trip in Mexico, I took a couple weeks off, and then I just started writing, and I didn't know what I was doing, but the Monarchs kind of led the way. And every draft I'd read and I'd be like, it's not good enough, and I start over, and everything kind of fell together, and I got really lucky. I really do thank the Monarchs. I feel like they were my teachers there, and every draft they were like, come on, you can do better than that. And then what's really cool is, so the Monarchs gave me this bike tour, right? And then I'm like, I gotta basically, like, if I can write a book to them, that's like a way to say thank you. It's a way for me to give my energy to the world so that the Monarch has a better chance. And so I wrote this book as like a thank you letter to the Monarchs. And then the Monarchs have turned around and they're like, oh, let me thank you. And they've given me all these other opportunities like tonight. And it's just this really beautiful relationship of reciprocity. And I'm so grateful.
And one more from YouTube. It's mentioned in the book, but you did have a special relationship with libraries. So it's kind of a biased question, but how did you use them during this trip?
Yeah, libraries are so crucial to bike touring. As a bike tourist, you often are, just on the road alone. And libraries become like this wonderful place where no one's judging you. You don't have to spend you don't spend money. You're welcomed. And then you could park your bike, and especially in bad weather, and you can go inside and warm up, and there's outlets so you can charge your phone. That's always important. And before phones, that was the only place to check your email. So I have spent hundreds and hundreds of hours at libraries, and so grateful for them. And I just think without libraries, I think bike touring in a lot of ways would be impossible.
And it looks like we had one more that just came in. How far did you ride every day, and what was the longest day?
My average was about 60 miles a day, which is very reasonable bike touring. I've met people that go way, way more. I did a few 100-mile days, mostly because I would schedule these presentations, and I'd say I'm going to be there in 2 weeks, and so I'd have to get there in 2 weeks. And so one thing I would do is I'd look at the forecast and I'd say, okay, I've got 200 miles in 3 days or 4 days. And I'd look and I'd say, okay, tomorrow I'm going to have a tailwind, which means the wind's at your back. So life is good. But then the next 3 days is the storm's coming in and I'm going to have a headwind. So I would try and wake up early and just bike as far as I could with the tailwind. And then the other days I could go slower and not stress. So I never missed a presentation, which is quite a feat, actually. And yeah.
Well, okay. Well, thank you very much for that inspiring presentation. I think you've probably inspired a lot of us to, support the Monarchs, take some time to see what we see in nature, because we've got a native prairie near us and some forest preserves. So, it is right in our backyard. So thank you again for this presentation, and thank you all for joining us. Everyone have a good evening, and we'll see you at our next program.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.